G'day and welcome to this episode of Cuppa with the Jesuit. I'm Father Robin Koning, Provincial Assistant for Vocations for the Australian Jesuit Province.
And I'm Jesuit student Julian Butler, and Father Robin and I are joined today from Cambridge, England by Father Philip Moller. Philip, welcome.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Julian. It's great to see you and be with you from over the waters.
Father Phil, you're in Cambridge at the moment, but based usually at Oxford. Would you tell us what it is that you're doing in those places, those great centres of learning?
Well, I'll begin where I am now. I'm here in the University Library of the Catholic Chaplaincy called Fisher House, named after St. John Fisher, who was the first martyr in the English Reformation, the Catholic martyr. And in fact, that happened here in Cambridge in the year 1535. The reason why I'm here at the moment is I'm filling in as the assistant chaplain, but normally I live in Oxford, what they call the other place here. And there I am doing what they call post-doctoral research, or I have a post-doctoral position where I've just finished my doctorate and I'm working on basically turning my thesis into a book and also translating from the French the original sources that I worked on during my thesis. So it's a chance to really take that next step with the doctoral research that you've done and really get it known and bed it down so people can understand what you've done. Really.
And you did your doctorate there at Cambridge.
I did.
And now you're working on getting that published in the other place. Do you want to say a bit about what your doctorate was about and what who wrote those original sources?
That's right. So I work in an area called philosophical theology or fundamental theology. And what does that mean? Well, that means how do we understand our faith, those things we believe, as credible? How do they have credibility in the modern world? And I work particularly on a French Jesuit called Henri de Lubac, who lived at the beginning of the 20th century and wrote these texts just about the time of the war. And the very interesting thing about de Lubac is that he himself wasn't a philosopher who lived abstractly or in the clouds. He was very applied in both his philosophy and his theology. And in fact, he was a great worker with the French resistance in the south of France, resisting the spread of basically fascism through the Vichy regime to the south. And he and his Jesuit friends at the Scholastica in Fourier, in fact, set up a printing press in the back of the Scholastica of the house. And they would deliver to Catholics right across the south of France why they should spiritually resist the onset of fascism all the way down. And that was a very grounded or connected way of the actual academic thinking or the theoretical thinking that he did. And part of my project is how can we approach human knowledge or intellectual knowledge that God exists? So basic questions of the existence of God. To say to somebody, we believe for these intellectual reasons that God does exist. And in fact, we can show this. And that's really important when you're having dialogues with philosophers who may be atheists or non, and very helpful when you talk to scientists who say, well, I only believe the hypotheses of empiricism, for example. So it's an opportunity to be able to have those conversations with people outside your own faith tradition. So I look specifically at questions of how we can come to know God in our mind, and then how that, I suppose, harmonizes with the desire that we have for God in our hearts.
Phil, the intellectual tradition, the academic tradition of the Jesuits is strong and something the society is known for. Is it something that has always engaged you as a Jesuit, that maybe drew you to the Jesuits?
Indeed. I mean, before I joined, I did history as my undergrad and law, and I practiced as an insolvency lawyer for a little bit, quite a while. And so when I got to studies, as a Jesuit, as you well know from these series, we do philosophy first and then theology. I discovered the deep intellectual tradition of the church and the real interesting way that both philosophy and theology has shaped our culture as it is today. So I was very drawn by the intellectual history. And in fact, the Jesuits have such an important part in that to play in that role, especially in the last 500 years. And so it wasn't something I initially thought I would be attracted to, because I loved being a lawyer and I felt a loss when I gave it up, but it was a loss for the greater good, in the sense I was more deeply desiring something even more substantial. And the work of philosophy and theology, particularly as it's placed in history, I find immensely satisfying. And it's really important too for communicating the faith. And that's where I think my real desire has emerged to, and the excitement for me is both intellectual and coming really from inside, is to communicate what we believe and why we believe it. So intellectual history is important for me in communicating our faith, and it's very exciting, I find. And I would never have had the opportunity to do that were it not for being a member of the Society of Jesus, for being a Jesuit. So I think my horizons have expanded enormously. I've now been in the Society for 15 years, and each year I can think more widely and deeply, not due to anything that I've done, but the experiences and the opportunities which I've been given, afforded, and really exposed to in the Australian province of the Society of Jesus. So I found it a very unexpected journey. That's why I kind of call my vocation something as an exposure, or seeing the God of surprises, because each time something comes up, it's a surprise, and usually a good surprise. So that, I think, for me, is a good thing. Yeah.
Was those surprises already coming when you went to a Jesuit high school?
I did.
And was there already some of that awakening of intellectual interest there, or was that not quite on the radar in the same way? What happened between that and your eventually joining the society?
Right. So I first encountered the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, in Adelaide, Australia. So I went to St. Ignatius College from the age of about 9 years old, in fact. It's in year 4, I think. And I was very fortunate because I was exposed to Jesuits from a very young age and really formed by their intellectual curiosity and their example. And so there's never not been a period of my life where there has been Jesuit leadership. And so I think that was an important part of my formation. So I went through and I was taught, Father Kelly, Terry Kelly, who just went to God, taught me science and physics. Father Mullins taught me in year 5, the parish priest of Norwood, and many others. In year 10, I swore that I would never be a high school teacher. And in year 12, I swore that I would never be a priest, and I've ended up doing both. So I was very much attracted by the Jesuits' openness and intellectual curiosity, and also the formation in faith, why we believe, and why our faith is crucial to who we are as Christians and as human beings. It wasn't until I was at university, and I mentioned I was doing history and I was doing law, that I felt in my early 20s a deep restlessness, not from anything that I'd received in the past, but I felt that the work I was doing was intellectually satisfying, but in some ways it wasn't enough. And I couldn't tell you why it wasn't enough at the time. But I came and I was praying. I just dropped into church one day, and I was not the usual kind of a guy who would just randomly drop into church, but I had this felt need, so I just did. And there was this book by a British Jesuit called Jerry Hughes, called, as I said, God of Surprises. And I began to recognize from that book that the restlessness that I felt inside me was in fact a desiring for something more, which was the Lord. You know, Augustine's line, "You have made us for yourself, O God, and restless is our hearts until it rests in you." And I realized that longing was not that what I was doing was bad, it just wasn't enough, or it just wasn't deep enough in that sense. And so I loved my life. I had a great job. I had great friends. I was very privileged, really, in that sense. But at that stage, I began to feel the Lord sort of tugging as if on a string, saying, what more is needed here? Can you go deeper? How can you give yourself more fully to the project of what service means? And in that way, I found myself drawn to, in the end, through a period of discernment over quite a long time and some very good spiritual direction, to realize that, in fact, my life would be most happily and fruitfully spent as a Jesuit. It was almost like a process of peeling layers off an onion as I got to know myself and my desires better, of drilling down and realizing that my surface desires to be successful, or for reputation, or to make money, or to impress my friends, were surface desires. And in fact, there was something far more difficult but satisfying which sat underneath that. And that went hand in hand with, for me, joining the Jesuits and becoming a priest. So it was a process of discovery for me, and one that was a very, I suppose we use the word consoling, by which I mean relieving, internally pleasing, satisfying process.
Well, it sounds like from what you've said that this wasn't a process that ended walking in the door of the Jesuit novitiate, that unfolding, that discovery of self is something that's gone on. People often assume, I think, that there's a moment of absolute clarity or certainty that gets you through the door, and then it all plays out as expected or something like that. But what you're describing is something that unfolds from prior to joining and keeps unfolding as you live Jesuit life.
Absolutely right. I would suggest to you that it is best described as a process of uncovering or discovery. And you are gently led along a path, or at least this is my experience. And at each turn or at each stage, you discover something new about yourself, about the world, about your relationship with God. And realizing that each is a deeper movement towards entrusting yourself into the love and the care of the Lord. That's the hope, and that's usually how it works out. Obviously, there are tips and traps, and we all fall over from time to time, and we stuff things up. I certainly have. But by and large, it is a process of being led in trust, and that trust is an opening up to the gift of faith, and faith, the gift, right? You can't decide to believe. You have to open yourself up in decision, and then you get that gift. And so I call it a continual of I suppose, being brave enough or having the courage to take that step of opening yourself up more and more. And as you say, Jules, it doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual entrusting of self and saying, yeah, I can do this. And I can do this for this bit. Or in my case, I made a fatal error in that I actually said at one point in my discernment, I said, Lord, what is it that you want me to do with my life? Now that was a stupid decision because God actually answered what he wanted me to do. And in the end, it was a very beautiful decision because it was uncovering my deepest self, what I thought I knew, but I wasn't really fully conscious of. And so that's the importance of prayer, right? And if we entrust ourselves to God, he will lead us gently in ways most unexpected and often into a vocation in ways that we never thought possible. I never thought I would be in an overseas university, having finished a doctorate in fundamental theology, having lived before then I was with the Jesuit formation in Boston in the United States of America. And then I am in Cambridge now, and now I live in Oxford, the UK. I would never, ever have done any of those things. And it's not a matter of globetrotting and seeing the world as some people like to make fun of Jesuits. It's about being, exposed to just what the society is working with on an international level.
Phil, you've answered this in some ways in telling your own story, but if you were talking to a young man considering Jesuit life at the moment, any particular sorts of things you'd want to say to him?
Yeah, I would. I'd say our life is a life of generosity. And so if you're a young person with a big heart, an open heart, who looks out at the world and sees a great need, but also sees great goodness in the world, and also the world that needs work, needs healing, needs ministry to attend to those things. Dwell on them, contemplate them, for example, and say, well, how can I be a part of that? Imagine yourself as saying, what could I do with the limited or the great resources that I have, maybe the privileged education that I've got, or indeed the promptings to say, nourish that desire that's within you to do something about it. I think the second thing would be enter into a good decision-making process, but don't keep putting it off. If you keep putting it off, something else will come up and something else will come up, but it is immensely fruitful if you have the courage to say yes. The yes is really important because the grace flows from that, and you really, are helped in terms of courage and excitement to do that. I would also say that we are men of the church, that we are here to serve the church, and particularly if you want to be a priest in the society, that offering the sacraments and making them available to people and caring for souls is a really important part of what we do. And I think the other one is, I do think the church looks to the Jesuits to provide some sort of thought leadership, as it were, in the big questions. And I think those three things, for me, would be constantly in the mix to someone who might be thinking about joining, and then, of course, always be guided by someone who appears to know what they're talking about. I think that's good.
Thanks for joining us in this episode of this series of A Cuppa with the Jesuit. It's been great talking to you.